The scene that day was nothing special. The sky was clear, the streets bustling with people, and on the main street, bus number 32 rolled along as it did every day. The breeze was light, carrying the scent of morning coffee from sidewalk cafes, small vendors, and thin coats worn by the city's workers hurrying to their offices. But this ordinary, routine journey was about to change forever as an inevitable confrontation began to stir right inside that bus. Lena Thomas, an independent black journalist, boarded bus number 32. She was a woman in her 30s, slender but resilient, with a sharp and understanding gaze. She was not only a journalist, but also a strong advocate for her community's rights. Her job often required her to travel and work outdoors. Among ordinary people she always cared about and studied. That day, she had just left an important meeting on social inequality, feeling both tense and determined. She joined the bustling crowd on the sidewalk and boarded the crowded bus. The hurried city pace did not distract Lena. On the contrary, it made her more aware of the issues she was pursuing in her work. She gently walked past rows of seats where passengers were absorbed in their own tasks and finally chose a seat by the window. Her thoughts were preoccupied with the upcoming article, the research papers piled up in the black briefcase she carried, all of which distracted her for a moment. The only thing she did not notice was the unfriendly attention from the bus driver. The bus driver, a middle-aged man named Tom Mitchell, had driven this route for many years. But today, the gloom in his eyes was unlike any other day. Though he greeted the passengers with a tired smile, there was something that had made him uncomfortable. It certainly wasn't the first time he had seen a black woman board his bus, but Lena was different. As Lena paid her fare and made her way to her seat, Tom looked at her indifferently, then returned to his work. But for some reason, his gaze lingered on her longer than it did on the other passengers. As the bus started moving, Lena felt something different in the air, a strange feeling as if something was wrong. She couldn't understand why the driver was looking at her so strangely, but she focused on her work, opened her laptop, and typed the first few lines for her article. After a while, the bus stopped to pick up more passengers, and just as Lena stood up to find another seat near the door, she heard Tom's stern voice from behind. "No, you can't sit there. You need to go to the back of the bus. That seat is not for you." Lena stopped, surprised and confused. She didn't think she had done anything wrong. She had paid her full fare, and the rules for seating were clear on the bus. She had never encountered anything like this before. "Excuse me, may I sit here?" she asked again, her eyes wide as she looked at the driver. But Tom, unmoved, shouted louder. "Didn't you hear me? I told you to go to the back. That seat is not for you." His words were like a command, a harsh rejection. Lena stood there, unable to believe what she had just heard. Throughout her many years of working in this field, she had heard enough stories about discrimination and injustices happening in daily life. But never before had she felt like she was directly becoming the victim of it. A moment of silence lingered in the bus. The passengers around seemed hesitant. No one said anything. A few eyes furtively glanced at Lena, but no one dared to intervene. A man sitting in the back began to look down at his phone, seemingly wanting to ignore the situation. A woman frowned, but remained silent. The air in the bus seemed to freeze. This wasn't just an argument between a woman and a bus driver. It was a systemic confrontation where values about rights and fairness were being put to the test. Lena could not accept this. She could not remain still in the face of such blatant discrimination. She turned to face Tom, her eyes glistening with determination. "I paid for my fare. I will sit where I want," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Her words, though gentle, carried strength. She looked into the eyes of those around her. They did not turn away, but instead, their eyes showed uncertainty. Her words challenged not only Tom, but also all the witnesses to this incident. But instead of backing down, Tom became angrier. He slammed the brakes hard, causing the bus to stop abruptly. Passengers swayed, and the bus seemed to lose its balance. A man hurriedly grabbed the handrail, and a small woman struggled to keep herself from falling. "You'll regret this," Tom yelled, his voice filled with rage. He stood up from the driver's seat, stepped out of the cabin, and pointed directly at Lena. "You will go to the back, or I will force you off this bus immediately." At this point, the people around could no longer stay silent. Some started whispering, glancing at Lena and Tom, as if these declarations were something absurd. But Lena was not afraid. She stood firm, looking directly into Tom's eyes, resolute not to move. The bus ride was no longer a simple journey. It had turned into a battlefield for basic values of fairness, respect, and personal rights. Lena's challenge had just begun, but it would not stop here. A long silence enveloped the space inside the bus, as if all the sounds of the city had been paused. The heavy feeling Lena sensed wasn't just criticism from an uninformed man, but the entire system that had long neglected her rights, as well as those of people like her. The glances from the passengers around her were no longer mere curiosity. They were filled with timidity, hesitation, unsure of what to do or say in this crucial moment. Lena did not back down. Each of her words was heavy, like stones striking the air. She wasn't afraid. She didn't retreat. Her eyes stayed fixed on Tom, staring into his eyes, filled with discomfort, as though looking straight into the source of all the injustices she had witnessed over the years. "I pay for my fare. I have the right to sit here," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Each word she spoke was a challenge. Tom stood there, his large, muscular body challenging the softness of Lena's figure. He growled loudly, his voice full of resentment. "You don't have any rights here, do you understand?" His words struck the quiet like a punch. The atmosphere was taut like a string, eyes widened, and whispers grew louder. Lena noticed the shift in the air. She felt that it wasn't just her facing off against Tom, but the eyes around her were witnessing the revelation of a reality society had long ignored. The bus now seemed drained of all energy, but Tom grew even more tense. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes never leaving Lena, even though he was facing forward. It seemed like he was about to explode. Each of Lena's words was like an arrow piercing his heart, revealing his weakness and his lack of awareness regarding human rights. Lena wasn't just fighting for her own rights, but for those who were oppressed, for those whose voices had been ignored by society. Lena took a deep breath, feeling something rising within her. The quiet calm helped her realize that she had to fight to the end. She could not retreat. She could not allow anyone, even the driver of this bus, to insult and push her out just because of one thing: the color of her skin. She could not let those around her sit silently and endure the absurdity. And then Tom's explosion came. He slammed on the brakes, causing the bus to stop suddenly. A loud screech rang out, and the bus rocked, forcing a few passengers to hastily grab the handrails. A sense of dizziness and suffocation filled the space. A woman near the window grimaced, clutching her child to her chest to prevent them from falling. Lena did not move, standing still as if unaffected by the chaos unfolding around her. "Get off now," Tom growled, this time not just as a threat, but as an uncontrollable outburst of rage. He stood up from his seat, stepped out of the driver's cabin, and pointed directly at Lena. He took heavy steps toward her. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice full of threat. The tension in the air stretched like a taut string. Lena just stood there looking straight at him, her eyes unwavering, her determination shining brightly. "I'm not someone you can control," she replied. Each of her words was firm as a rock, unshaken. She looked into his eyes, into what he represented: the discrimination, the irrationality of long-held biases. The passengers around her seemed to have lost their silence. A man sitting near the door stood up, his eyes filled with dissatisfaction. "This isn't my business, but you're going too far," he said, his hands trembling but still firm. His words made some other passengers glance at each other, their faces showing discomfort, but also a hint of agreement. Tom turned back, his face flushed, his body so tense it seemed ready to explode. He could no longer control himself. His voice roared louder than ever. "You'll regret doing this. Get off the bus right now," he yelled, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the veins in his fists were bulging. Lena did not budge, not a single tremor. She knew this was the moment she had to stand up. This was a critical moment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had stayed silent, who had endured discrimination. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was standing up for those who had no voice, for all those oppressed in society. A young man sitting behind suddenly stood up, his phone in hand, lighting up. He began recording. "Everyone will see this," he said, his voice calm but full of certainty. "He has no right to abuse her." His words seemed like a signal. It appeared that all the passengers on the bus were starting to realize that this was no longer a personal issue, but a bigger one, the racial discrimination happening right before their eyes. And they, despite their initial hesitation, could no longer remain silent. Lena turned to look at the people around her, her gaze passing over each one. She didn't need to say anything more, because each person could feel that this was a moment that couldn't be ignored, a time to stand up, to no longer remain silent. And as the tension reached its peak, the sound of a police siren began to echo from a distance. Passengers peeked through the windows, some holding their breath, others hurriedly pulling out their phones, sure they were recording everything. Outside, a crowd had begun to gather, attracting the attention of passersby. The incident was no longer just a confrontation between a driver and a passenger, but a battlefield for basic human rights and fairness in society. In that moment, Lena was no longer a lone woman. She was a symbol of struggle, and while everything around her seemed to be a battle, she knew that victory didn't just come from reclaiming the seat, but from never staying silent in the face of injustice. The tense moment lingered in the air, as if everything on the bus had suddenly slowed down, quieter than ever before. The streets outside the window remained busy. The blaring horns of cars filled the air. But inside the bus, time seemed to stand still. Everyone's gaze was fixed on Lena and Tom. Each person remained silent, but their eyes, though no one spoke, told a long story they were telling themselves. Lena stood there, facing Tom, not backing down. She looked at him with unwavering eyes, full of determination, without a hint of fear. In that moment, the eyes of the passengers around her were like shining beams, beams of confusion, hesitation, and also silent empathy that no one could voice. The people around her felt the injustice, but no one knew what to do. No one dared to speak up, or perhaps they didn't know how to change the situation. They sat there, silently, like puppets bound by invisible strings. A middle-aged man sitting behind Lena lowered his head, seemingly not wanting to get involved in the situation, but his eyes could not hide the sadness. He gripped the newspaper tightly, not because he wanted to read, but because it was like something that helped him conceal the confusion clearly visible on his face. He wanted to speak, to say something, but his mouth couldn't open, even just to say one word. He felt that if he spoke, he would have to confront the truth that he too was silent while wrongs were unfolding right before his eyes. Lena's actions had pulled him out of the false peace he had once found in his ordinary mornings, and he didn't know if he had the courage to stand up for her. Next to him, a young woman, holding her small child, sat quietly, looking at Lena with an expression full of shame. She didn't dare to look directly at Tom, only gazing at Lena, her eyes as if sending an unspoken apology. She wanted to say, "I see, I understand, but I can't do anything." She couldn't move from her seat, as she feared the consequences she would face. But in her heart, empathy and sorrow for Lena flooded her. Every breath she took was filled with anxiety and confusion. The child in her lap played with a scrap of paper, unaware of the tension in the air, but it seemed that even the child sensed the tension in her mother's heart. The mother's gaze toward Lena was full of contradiction, wanting to help, but too scared to act. Another man, also middle-aged, wearing a fine suit, sat quietly, staring out the window. He looked straight at the scene outside, but not at the world. Rather, as a way to avoid facing the truth unfolding right before his eyes. Inside him, doubt passed like dark clouds, conflicting emotions rising. He felt ashamed for not speaking up. Everything was clear. The racism was undeniable, but how could he stand up in a society where such things had become familiar, a part of the so-called unwritten rules? He bit his lip, clenched the leather bag beside him, but still couldn't speak. Nearby, a young girl sitting by the window, chin resting in her hand, stared intently at her phone screen. She seemed to have started recording long ago. It wasn't that she didn't know she was capturing a tense confrontation, but she knew she was recording the silence of those around her. She knew, no matter what, this video would be undeniable proof of a greater event, of the racism that everyone, including herself, couldn't avoid. She knew that the confusion of everyone, their silence, was part of the story she would bring to light. She wasn't afraid, just a bit anxious when she realized that, even though the injustice was being recorded, would anyone actually do anything to change it? Would anyone truly stand up, even with a small action, to change this world? An elderly woman sitting near Lena's seat looked at the scene before her. Her hands trembled as she clutched her old fabric bag, her face wrinkled with age. Yet, in her tired eyes, sorrow and empathy could not be concealed. She had witnessed many similar events throughout her life. She knew that not always could one stand up against these societal rules, but she also knew that if nothing was done, things would never change. She couldn't stand up, but she felt there was nothing left to do but hope. Hope for the younger generations like Lena. Hope for a change that she may never see in her lifetime, but that might come for the next generation. Each glance, each gesture, though small, reflected a world torn between right and wrong, between empathy and silence. The people around Lena knew they were part of this fight, whether they spoke up or not. They sensed the injustice, they felt the discrimination, but they also felt the silent empathy not expressed in words, but in every look, in every breath. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes no words need to be spoken, just standing beside someone in their fight was already a meaningful action. Those gazes didn't need to speak, but they created a silent wave. That wave rose not because of powerful words or decisive actions, but because of the recognition of the truth, the deep empathy from the witnesses. In this moment, they were the ones fighting alongside Lena, even if they couldn't raise their voices. The whole bus seemed to settle in a silent, empathetic stillness, the silence of a society that still hasn't found a way to face the injustices that have long existed. Everything seemed to be still, with only the sounds of the bus reverberating through the cramped space. However, in this heavy atmosphere, the glances, the hesitant sighs, could no longer keep the silence intact. Outside the bus, commotion began to spread, not just the attention of passers-by, but whispers and empathetic glances from passengers who had previously stayed out of the situation. Tom felt the change. The coldness in Lena's gaze was something he could not easily handle. The more he grumbled, the more threatening he became. But in Lena's eyes, there was nothing but resilience, a determination not to yield. This was no longer just a personal conflict. Tom could see, even without words, that everyone around him was standing with Lena, at least in their hearts. Then a voice spoke up, not loud, but enough to break the silence that had engulfed the bus. An older man, full of resolve, stood up from his seat. His eyes didn't meet Tom's, but instead focused on the passengers quietly watching. "This is not how we solve problems," he said, his voice firm. His words weren't just for Tom. They were for those who had remained silent, those who were sometimes too afraid to speak out. Every small sound from this man was like a drumbeat urging change, a call to not just Tom, but to everyone else as well. Lena felt her heart beat faster, but not out of fear. She felt empathy growing in her heart, sensing the shared support from those around her. These words were like a beam of light cutting through the darkness. It seemed that the atmosphere had been broken, and the tension had lessened a little. The man had not only spoken up for Lena, but had also empowered her, reminding everyone what to do when faced with injustice. After the man finished speaking, another silence fell, but this time it was a respectful one. The gazes were no longer doubtful, no longer evasive. They all turned to Lena, as if seeing a victorious figure in a battle that was far from over. Every glance said one thing. They stood with her, whether they said it aloud or not. Suddenly, a young voice rose from the middle of the bus. A girl about 17, with long hair falling around her shoulders, stood up. Her gaze met Tom's without hesitation. "She's just doing what she has every right to do," she said, her voice full of certainty, with no fear at all. "Why should we accept this?" Her words seemed to ignite a shift in the crowd. They were no longer just bystanders. They were starting to share the frustration, the disagreement. The looks directed at Tom now were no longer skeptical, but filled with suppressed anger, as silent empathy was slowly transforming into action. Lena realized the girl's gaze was not just one of defense. She represented the future generation, those who were ready to not stay silent when witnessing wrong. At this moment, Lena was no longer standing alone. The sharing from the crowd had begun. Each word from the others affirmed that they did not accept the discrimination, that they did not accept Tom's actions. Gradually, the shared empathy became a small but persistent flame, spreading through the hearts of the passengers. More and more eyes began to brighten. An older man stood up, his face filled with resolve. "I can't sit idly by when I see someone treated like this. We can't let actions like this exist." His voice was heavy, as though he had endured for a long time, but now it was a declaration of something greater. He wasn't just standing up for Lena, he was standing up for all those who had been oppressed, overlooked. His words were a welcome for change, a flag signaling the need to change our perceptions and actions in this society. Just seconds later, a round of applause erupted. At first, it was soft, like a shy gesture from those who hadn't dared to speak up, but then it grew louder, turning into a resounding clap. The people around, though not directly voicing their support, had shown it through their actions. The looks from those who had once stayed silent now blended into a silent yet powerful wave. They didn't need to say anything else, but that action was enough to prove that change was coming. They weren't just standing with Lena. They stood for what was right, for a society that would not accept discrimination. That scene, though not loud, was full of power. Lena looked at the faces around her, not with a sense of triumph, but with the eyes of someone who understood that she was no longer alone. Though no one had officially intervened in the situation, the support from the crowd, the few who stood up, had already been a great victory. Tom, feeling the loss of control rising within him, realized more and more that what he was doing was no longer just his own. The entire bus was now against him. He stood there, helpless, not knowing what to do with the looks, the pointed remarks from the passengers. He couldn't deny that the tension had reached a point where there was no turning back. And then the unmistakable sound of a police siren blared from outside, decisive and strong. The crowd outside had gathered. The police were here. Lena no longer felt afraid. The first steps of change had been made, not through shouting, but through voices rising from a community that was ready to stand for what was right, no matter how difficult it may be. The applause on the bus continued, as a confirmation that nothing could change unless we stand up together. When the sound of the police siren echoed outside, the atmosphere inside the bus shifted immediately. The eyes that were focused on Lena, Tom, and the surrounding crowd suddenly grew tense, as if everyone was waiting for something monumental, not only to resolve the conflict in the bus, but also to redefine the basic values of justice. Passengers who had previously exchanged confused glances now began to stir. They didn't just sit in silence, listening, but some had pulled out their phones, starting to record the decisive moments of this confrontation. Lena no longer felt alone. She felt the support of those around her. Each phone that lit up, each passenger who stood, gave her a renewed sense of hope. What had been buried in indifference for so long was now beginning to surface. Lena turned to look at Tom, the driver, who stood frozen, his eyes staring blankly at the steering wheel, as if he could control everything just by looking down. She noticed that he no longer had the same confidence as before. His eyes were now filled with uncertainty, no longer carrying the same force as his earlier threats. The police were drawing closer, and the truth of the situation seemed to be becoming clearer. Lena no longer needed to argue. The truth was already there, and all she needed to do now was stand firm, proving that speaking out and standing her ground were the necessary actions to bring about change. The police officers boarded the bus, two of them dressed in dark uniforms. One moved quickly towards Tom, while the other turned to survey the passengers, their eyes sweeping across the crowd as if searching for the truth that each person on the bus might reveal. Lena did not look at the officers, but instead focused her gaze on the crowd outside, where civilians, volunteers, and reporters had started to gather. Applause from them echoed through the window, a wave of empathy from the outside community that empowered Lena further. One of the police officers approached Lena and looked at her with a calm, non-judgmental gaze, but one full of understanding. "Can you tell us what happened?" His voice was neither hurried nor imposing. Lena knew this was her moment to share her story. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting the officers with calm but firm resolve. "It's simple. I got on the bus, paid my fare like everyone else, but the driver told me I had to go to the back just because I'm black. I tried to explain that I had the right to sit wherever I wanted, but he refused to listen and treated me very aggressively," she said, her voice clear and steady, as if everything had been decided in her mind long ago. The officer listened, nodding but asking no further questions. He turned his attention to Tom, who was still standing there, his eyes showing clear signs of confusion. The officers began to ask Tom to put his hands behind his back in preparation for an arrest. But then something unexpected happened. One of the earlier passengers, the older man, stood up and walked towards the officer with a serious expression. "I'm a witness," he said, his eyes no longer hesitant but full of determination. The officer turned and looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "I saw everything from beginning to end. I heard the driver's words clearly, and I saw how he treated her. This is racism, and it must be dealt with properly," he said. His words were undeniable evidence, and once he stood up, other passengers began to speak out as well. "We heard it too." A woman from the back spoke up, her voice firm and strong, much different from the initial hesitation. The crowd no longer remained silent. Each person stood up. Each person agreed with Lena's actions, whether through a glance or a small comment. The officers nodded. What they needed now wasn't more explanations, but action. The confirmations from the crowd had made everything clear. As Tom was led away, his face changed from one of arrogance and self-righteousness to one of disappointment and confusion. There was nothing left to say. He could no longer deny the truth. The passengers around him no longer had to look away. They didn't need to wait for anything else. They had clearly seen the discrimination, and their actions, though small, were a strong statement that they would not accept it. The officer turned back to Lena, looking at her with an assessing gaze, but not judgmental. "You did the right thing," he said, and Lena simply nodded, but in her heart, she knew that wasn't just praise. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that her actions were not only correct but necessary, that every individual has the right to stand up for themselves and their rights. In that moment, Lena felt something greater than just winning a personal confrontation. She felt a change happening within the community, from the empathetic individuals to those who had remained silent for too long. The truth was not only discovered through words but through actions, through the transformation in how people perceived and acted in the face of injustice. It was a moment when every individual realized that they could make a difference, even with a small action, but one that could change an entire system. The police had completed their job, and Tom was finally taken away. Lena stood there, steadfast like a shield, not only protecting herself, but also the values she had always fought for. She didn't need to say anything more, because in the eyes of the crowd, in the soft smiles full of understanding from the witnesses, she knew the truth had been revealed, not through words, but through action. The story didn't end here. It had just begun. When the bus came to a stop, everything didn't pause in the way Tom might have imagined. The silence remained, but it was no longer timid. It was a tense silence, a space ready to explode. Tom stood there, gripping the steering wheel, his gaze like a cornered animal, with nowhere left to retreat. Lena had not only stood up for herself, but she was representing a larger fight, a fight against discrimination, a fight to acknowledge that everyone, no matter who they are, deserves to be respected. The police had arrived, and that was a clear sign that things could never return to the way they were. However, the situation wasn't that simple. People didn't just want this incident to end right away. They didn't want to be mere bystanders. They wanted to take part, to step into the fight to protect justice. In that moment, Lena realized that the silence from the crowd wasn't consent. It was the tension yet to explode, and she knew she was the one to ignite this fire. When the officer approached and asked Tom to stop, the scene was not just an intervention by law enforcement. It was a testament to a profound shift within the community. Lena stood firm, not because she feared, but because she knew that now she couldn't look away. She had chosen to stand up, and now nothing could make her step back. "She's right," the older man who had spoken first continued. "We can't stay silent when things like this happen. I've witnessed acts of racism like this too many times. Today is the time for everyone to stand up." His words rang out into the air like a bell, awakening everyone around. The eyes began to fill with understanding and determination. A few passengers stood up, their eyes shining with empathy. One woman, still holding her child close, but now with no fear in her gaze, spoke up. "She hasn't done anything wrong. She's only asking for her rights," she said, her voice firm but soft, a statement not just for Lena, but for everyone who had been disregarded in society. As the woman spoke, many passengers started looking at one another. Some, who had stayed silent before, now seemed to realize they could no longer stand outside of this. A middle-aged man, his face covered with a beard and a tough expression, stood up and said, "No one has the right to force anyone to do something they don't want to. We all have equal rights." That's what I've taught my children. And today, I won't let anyone forget that. Lena looked at these people, feeling a shift in the atmosphere. Their words seemed to awaken something inside her, something stronger than fear, stronger than everything she had endured. She was no longer just a black woman confronting racism. She had become a symbol of a movement, of the basic rights we all have the right to demand. One by one, people stood up, not because they were too strong, but because they felt this injustice. They had lived in a society too long where behaviors like this were still considered normal, where standing up to protect someone else had become a rarity. And today, they could no longer stand on the sidelines. Tom stood there, his eyes now full of fear. He realized that the threats and pressure he had imposed on others no longer had any power. The people he had once thought would remain silent were now standing together, united by the same cause. The division among the passengers was gone, replaced by a strong unity. Even though not everyone could speak, their silence spoke volumes. The officer continued to investigate the incident. Other passengers began adding their testimony, no longer afraid or hesitant. The bus had now become a courtroom of justice, where the witnesses were no longer bystanders, but were ready to stand up against injustice. Tom was led away, not because he had committed a personal error, but because he represented a broken system, a system where human rights were overlooked, where racism and power were used to oppress the vulnerable. As Tom left the bus, it wasn't just him who was leaving. It was a part of change, a part of a new movement where each individual can stand up to protect their rights. Lena stood still, but not to receive thanks. She knew that this battle had just begun. She had come a long way to stand here today, but she also understood that she couldn't change everything alone. She needed the help of everyone. And today, she not only received help, but also acknowledgement that every individual has the right to stand up when injustice occurs. As the bus continued on its journey, the atmosphere inside had changed. Passengers were no longer silent. Some exchanged understanding glances, nodding lightly. No words were necessary because they understood that today they had done the right thing. Nothing could stop change once it had begun. Lena looked out the window, and in her heart, the belief in justice was reignited. She had fought, and she knew this battle would continue, not just for her, but for all those who had stayed silent for too long. As the bus continued its journey, a different atmosphere slowly began to spread within the confined space. Lena still sat there, silently, her hand gripping her briefcase, her gaze fixed on the window where the city rushed by, unaware that within this bus, a struggle had erupted and there was no turning back. She knew that her fight was not just a personal story, but also the story of all those who had stayed silent, of all those who never had the chance to stand up to injustice. The police had taken Tom away, but that didn't mean everything was over. The witnesses, the other passengers, all of them stood still in a moment full of meaning, a moment when they were no longer outsiders, but were participants in a quiet yet powerful revolution. The eyes filled with empathy, giving strength without words, without thanks, but with an acknowledgement that everyone has the right to stand up for what is right. On the bus now, there was no more hesitation, no more indifference. A woman, who had previously only looked down at her phone, now looked up and asked, "She's right, isn't she?" Her voice was gentle, but full of determination. The looks around her, no one spoke, but the small nods were a silent acknowledgement. The silence was no longer complicity with injustice, but mutual understanding, unspoken agreement. Lena felt that in each of those gazes, understanding had transcended all differences. She was no longer just a black woman facing racism on a bus, but she had become part of a larger struggle, part of a community starting to realize that only when everyone stands together can real change occur. She had not only fought for herself, but for all those who couldn't stand up, for all those who had stayed silent out of fear, out of the sense that their lives were not important enough to change. The entire bus now felt like a battlefield, not of violence or argument, but of people standing together to protect what was right. The passengers didn't just sit by and ignore the situation. They had quietly but resolutely joined the fight. And in each of them, though not everyone dared to speak, each glance, each small action was a declaration that they did not accept what was happening. Lena understood that this struggle wasn't just a one-time protest. It was the turning point of a series of changes that couldn't be undone. The witnesses, even though not directly involved, had become part of this fight. She was standing firm not only for herself, but for all those who had once been afraid when facing injustice, for all those pushed into the shadows of discrimination and oppression. In the following days, the story of bus number 32 began to spread throughout the city. News outlets, social media, all began reporting the incident, not as a typical altercation, but as an event that demonstrated a larger fight. Lena's name became a symbol of resilience, of the fight against injustice. Interviews with her no longer just focused on what had happened that day, but on a battle she had started, a battle that everyone in society could join. The passengers on that bus, those who had initially been mere bystanders, had now become an indispensable part of this story. They were no longer on the sidelines. They had started to realize that every action, no matter how small, could make a difference. A phone call to an office, a letter to the authorities, a social media post. All of these contributed to pushing for change. Lena hadn't sought attention, but the spread of her story proved that real change could happen when people stood up together. The struggle wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about one person standing up for their rights. It was about a society slowly changing its perspective, about a community no longer accepting wrongdoings. People began to realize that, even if they weren't directly involved in the struggle, each of them had a role to play in creating change. Conversations in families and offices on the streets all started to revolve around one big question. What will we do when faced with injustice? Lena stood firm, not because she felt like a hero, but because she understood that each individual has the right to fight for the values they believe in. She realized that this struggle would never stop at an individual level. It was part of a larger revolution. When everyone stands up, when each person can recognize and act for justice, nothing can stop change. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She had become part of a movement, a fight that we all must join. And as she stepped off the bus one early morning after the event, she no longer felt confused or afraid. She sensed that she wasn't alone, that everyone around her, even if they hadn't directly stood up, had changed. And that was part of the greatest victory she could hope for. The change in the community's perception, a struggle not just for the individual, but for all those who want to live in a just and equal society. In the days following the event on the bus, Lena felt a profound change within the community around her. She had not only stood up to protect her own rights, but to defend the rights of all those who had been oppressed, pushed to the margins of society because of their skin color or their position in life. But this struggle didn't end there. It had only just begun. Every step, every small action was part of a long journey that she knew would not be easy, but she also understood that this was the path to justice. As Lena's story began to spread, the media, social organizations, and ordinary citizens began to speak her name, not as a mere victor, but as a symbol of resilience, of standing up to injustice with nothing to protect her but her belief in justice. The interviews, the meetings with social activists and lawyers were all the first steps in her long journey. She was no longer just a victim. She had become the one who brought this issue to light, pulling it from the shadows of indifference and injustice. Lena knew that in this society, Every advance would be met with challenges, opposition, and even skepticism. But she also realized that without people like her, without anyone daring to stand up, the flawed systems would continue to exist without being questioned. Every day, she stepped outside. She was no longer just a black woman confronting a rude bus driver. She was a warrior, not only for herself, but for all those who had endured in silence. The journey toward justice wasn't just about calling the police or about Tom being dealt with. It was a long battle, a battle to change the community's consciousness, a battle to assert that human rights are invaluable and cannot be violated. Meetings with civil rights organizations, conversations with social activists, all were steps in this journey. Lena was no longer just an individual in this struggle. She had become part of a broader movement where everyone found strength to stand up. She began to realize that for years, black people, minorities, had fought too long in the dark and silence. They had grown accustomed to being overlooked, pushed out of society, belittled because of their skin color. But Lena understood that only when these people dared to speak up, only when small actions, personal struggles, were woven together into a collective movement, could this society change. And she had become one of the pioneers in this fight. Justice doesn't come overnight. It's a long process, full of challenges, sometimes tiring and full of disappointment. Lena had to face many criticisms, doubts from those who didn't understand her struggle, from those who couldn't fathom the pain she and people like her had endured. They couldn't understand how hard it is to change a system that has existed for so long. People in this society had grown so accustomed to oppression, to racism, that they no longer saw it. And because of that, Lena's fight, though important, became much harder. But Lena did not give up. She understood that change doesn't come from a single struggle, but from the combination of thousands, millions of other struggles. She began to see the change in how people around her perceived the situation. Those who had once remained silent now stood up. Civil rights organizations, social activist groups began to pay more attention to the issues she was fighting for. And those steps, though slow, were gradually building a strong foundation for a much larger change. Day by day, Lena received support from people she had never met, from those who understood the importance of this fight. A woman sent her a long letter, saying that Lena's story had inspired her, and now she had begun to stand up for her rights and those of others around her. A group of high school students organized a small protest, calling for racial equality and rights for all. These small but meaningful actions were proof that justice can be built from the first steps, and Lena knew that, even if things were slow, justice would come. She gave an interview with a national television channel. When asked about her goal, Lena simply replied, "I just want everyone to realize that we can change everything if we stand up. Justice is not something that can wait forever. It is something that must be demanded every day. We can't let it pass in silence." And that's exactly what Lena did. She didn't stop. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for all those being pushed out of society, for those forgotten in the shadows of discrimination and injustice. This road would not be easy, but Lena understood that great change cannot come from just one individual. It must come from solidarity, from millions of people willing to stand up for their rights and for the rights of others. And Lena had shown the world that a small step from one person, no matter what, can create a wave of change. Lena's story, from a moment of confrontation with a bus driver to her relentless fight for justice, is a journey full of challenges, resilience, and determination. But above all, it is a story about the power of speaking out and fighting for the most fundamental human values, equality and justice. Through these events, there are many profound lessons we can draw, not only for individuals but for society as a whole. First and foremost, The story emphasizes the importance of not remaining silent in the face of injustice. Lena, a woman standing alone on the bus, had to confront racism head-on and clearly. But instead of accepting it, instead of backing down from oppression, she chose to stand up and demand her rightful place. This is the first lesson we can learn. In life, no matter how difficult or dangerous it may seem, if we feel that we are being treated unfairly or harmed, there is nothing that should stop us from demanding justice. Silence is never the right choice when facing discrimination or injustice. The second lesson Lena imparts is the strength found in solidarity and the support of the community. At first, she might have felt alone, facing the challenge from an authoritative bus driver. But as the passengers on the bus began to speak out, as they no longer stood on the sidelines but started sharing their discontent, Lena realized that the power didn't lie in just one individual. The looks, the words from the witnesses created a great shift. The community, though small, when united, could create an unstoppable force. The community is not just the connection between strangers, but a shared awareness of a greater goal: protecting human rights and fighting against all forms of discrimination. From this story, we can also learn the importance of perseverance and determination in the fight for justice. Lena didn't stop after the incident on the bus. She continued her struggle through interviews, meetings with activists and social organizations, with one singular goal: to change the community's perception of racial discrimination. These meetings weren't easy steps, but part of a long, difficult journey. Justice cannot come quickly. It is an ongoing process requiring persistence and determination. Lena has become a role model for all those fighting for justice and equality, showing that sometimes change can only come through tireless efforts, staying committed to a goal, and never giving up in the face of challenges. Another profound lesson from Lena's story is that change starts with each individual. She may not have changed the whole world immediately, but she became an example for a greater movement, where each person can contribute a small part to make a difference. Lena's story is not just a simple act of resistance, but the beginning of a revolution in awareness. When one person stands up, faces injustice, and demands justice, it inspires others to do the same. Lena may not have been the first to fight, but she became the symbol of a movement where people began to realize that change can begin with them, through speaking the truth, through refusing silence. Finally, this story is a reminder that justice is not only achieved through words but through actions. True struggles are not just about bold declarations. They are about tangible actions. Lena didn't stop at merely speaking out against injustice. She acted. She went to social organizations, met with those who could help, and worked to ensure that her case wasn't just talked about but handled properly. Lena understood that justice doesn't come from empty conversations, but from real steps, from continuous efforts to turn words into actions. Lena's story is proof that no fight is in vain. Although the journey may be long and tiring, and though there are times when hope seems lost, every step, every action is a brick in the building of real justice. Lena has made us understand that as long as an individual dares to stand up, act, and persevere, nothing is impossible to change. The greatest lesson Lena teaches us is never give up for justice, for equality, and for yourself. However, this story is also a well-deserved critique of those who harbor racism, those who judge and oppress others based on their skin color and behavior. The actions of Tom, the bus driver, are not just the acts of one misguided individual, but are proof of a deeper system, where racism is silently accepted, where those in power use their strength to suppress the weak. People like Tom are not just enemies of justice. They are the nurturers of injustice and discrimination. And not just Tom, but every individual, every organization, every institution must reassess their habits actions, and biases to ensure that society is truly fair for all, no matter who they are. From this story, another lesson is the resilient will of Black people in a harsh society. They have faced challenges, pressure, and discrimination not just for a day, but for an entire history. And throughout that time, they have stood firm, continued to fight, and never stopped hoping for a more just society. Lena is a symbol of that spirit. She has faced many hardships in her life, but she never backed down. This is not only a lesson about an individual's resilience, but a statement of the strength of an entire community, a people who have endured much pain, yet never gave up on the dream of being treated equally. We may not live in an era of overt racial discrimination like before, but the lesson Lena brings is still incredibly valuable. It's a lesson about resilience, never backing down, and especially about a great struggle, not just for one individual, but for all those who live under the shadow of discrimination. When Black people, like Lena, continue to stand up for justice, they don't just change their own lives, they help build a fairer and more humane society for everyone.